Beni dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyorum. İnanıyorum ki benden sonraki arkadaşlarım da çok daha değerli bilgiler verecektir. Ben sözü şimdi benden sonraki konuşmacıya bırakıyorum. Tekrar selam ediyorum arkadaşlar. Söz benden sonraki arkadaşlar. Buyurun. Sözü Sayın Christian Kaunat'a veriyorum. Mr. Christian, board is yours. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here at your conference. Unfortunately, this year is a specific year, so we can't physically be present, but I hope that in future years, we'll be able to physically be in the same room and have the opportunity to meet in person. So thank you very much for having me. What I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is one of the aspects in terms of policing, intelligence, and of course, security cooperation that has been particularly important and also has been a backbone of a lot of my work on European policing and intelligence cooperation. The specific aspect that I want to talk to you a little bit more about is, of course, the creation and the operation of Europol as a law enforcement agency. That is quite a new and original law enforcement agency that the European Union has created, but it's part of a larger trend, because in the European Union, what we've seen is that for a number of years, and in fact, the European Parliament has already had several reports on this particular topic, there's been something called the agencification. Agencification is the development of and the growth of a number of different agencies that are specialized bureaucratic bodies outside the framework of general ministerial departments and staffed with neutral experts in order to carry out public tasks. Now, examples that I want to talk to you about are, for instance, the European Policing Agency, Europol, but of course also Frontex, the European Border Agency, the European Asylum Support Office, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, also the European Agency for the Management of Large-Scale IT Systems, the European Policing College, the kind of training agency for European police officers, CEPOL, the European Union's Judicial Cooperation Unit called Eurojust, and now in relation to that also the European Public Prosecutor's Office, as well as the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency and the European Network and Information Security Agency, ENISA. Now, why did European countries decide to delegate all these functions to what are, in a sense, technical agencies that are dealing, though, with very specific aspects of internal security, policing, and criminal justice? Well, the academic literature gives us a number of different reasons why European member states might want to do that. For instance, in terms of substantive uncertainty, it is better to delegate certain functions to agencies that can continue that kind of process of working on the particular policy, and as a result of that, ensure that the policy really meets its objective. One of the things that we also see as a reason now in the United States with the political uncertainty as to who exactly might be the president, which government might be in charge, the academic literature then tells us in those cases of political uncertainty, or in cases of the credibility of commitment problem, where maybe some states say that they need to be committed to the initiatives, but other states don't trust them. And in that sense, a depoliticized body is a functional solution to this particular problem that we might encounter. Also, in certain aspects, we have a lack of cooperation that needs increasing coordination and information sharing. And as a result of that, we bring in this agency to facilitate this kind of cooperation. Also, sometimes we can find that there's power struggles between different member states and the different institutions, where against a depoliticized body might be able to overcome these power struggles. And finally, that is something that politicians might be particularly interested in, that is, of course, blame shifting. Blame shifting is a scenario where politicians might realize a certain policy is advantageous, but it isn't one that is necessarily popular. By appointing technocratic bodies and providing them with those functions, they're able then to take the credit when credit is due, but shifting the blame when a policy becomes unpopular, and therefore agencies are quite well suited for this particular case. Now, Europol, in particular, as the kind of law enforcement body of the European Union, has been quite popular. It's been described in different movies also. For instance, in the US series Law and Order, we had the episode Pandora, where Europol was involved in terms of tracking down a particular criminal organization of organized crime. In the movie Ocean's 12, of course, Catherine Zeta-Jones also played the role there. But very often what we find is that in a fictional appearance, Europol appears more powerful than the reality on the ground, where, of course, the operational powers are not necessarily quite so significant as being portrayed in the media. Europol was first established under the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. It began its limited operations in 1994 in the form of the Europol Drugs Unit, commenced its full activities in 1999, and established its headquarters in The Hague with obviously more than 700 members of staff that are based there. It's not, and I think this is very important to point out, because a lot of people have this notion of Europol being an operational police force. Of course, Europol is not an executive police force, and in that sense, it doesn't have those direct powers to launch its own investigations. That does not mean Europol is not involved in investigations, but it doesn't launch its investigations on its own. Its aim is primarily to support EU member states and their law enforcement agencies in terms of gathering, analyzing, and disseminating information and coordinating those operations. Up to date, there have been a number of different operational and strategic agreements between Europol and other agencies of other countries, for instance, the United States and many other third states outside the framework of the European Union that have now agreements with Europol on a number of cooperation efforts. In terms of its ambition, it aims to facilitate primarily the exchange of information between member states. The exchange of information, often a very difficult problem in terms of coordinating between different member states, because of course you have the issue in terms of lack of trust, that member states don't necessarily trust one another to provide a full picture. In terms of intelligence sharing, this is a perennial problem, that member states don't necessarily trust one another enough. Sometimes don't trust each other enough because they don't know what that other member state might do with that information. Sometimes they don't trust each other enough because they don't want to necessarily show the sources, and providing that information might then be a way to establish what the sources are. And sometimes it might be a reason just because member states don't necessarily want to show that their intelligence analysis might be faulty, possibly, and don't want to necessarily show the gaps in their own analysis. So this is a difficult problem, and Europol is one of the solutions in order to overcome some of these problems. Its ambition and its objective, therefore, is also to obtain, to collate, and to analyze information and intelligence, and to provide member states with that information and intelligence. It's also its ambition to notify the various competent authorities of the different member states without delay in terms of the national units that are concerned by this and any connection identified in terms of criminal offenses. It also aims to aid investigations in the member states by forwarding whatever relevant information Europol has acquired to those various national units who are then able to, in a sense, conduct the investigations more fully and more comprehensively. It also aims to maintain a computerized system here in terms of collecting information and also in terms of containing data. Another objective is to participate in the support capacity in terms of joint investigation teams. That has been something that has been used far more commonly as of more recently. So there's been more and more joint investigation teams where, of course, Europol was, for instance, involved in the rest of a plot around Strasbourg and then the Strasbourg Cathedral and then the Strasbourg Christmas market and a number of different possible terrorist attacks that have been foiled thanks to those joint investigations because of Europol and the various national authorities. Another objective is to ask the competent authorities of the different member states concerned to conduct and to coordinate investigations in specific cases. Now, how does Europol work? Europol works in terms of Europol national units and also has liaison officers that are then attached to those. It has built a system of European information files and analysis work files. Over the years, we've seen an expansion of Europol's mandate, in particular in the area of counterterrorism. Counterterrorism is something that needs to be pointed out because counterterrorism was at the heart of disagreements between member states. If we go back many years ago, let's take member states such as Spain and France, they've had various disagreements in terms of how to handle, for instance, ETA terrorists. In the 1970s, ETA terrorists were seen as possible freedom fighters in the fight against Franco. In the 1980s, there was beginning of cooperation until the 1990s, when France and Spain, for instance, could not even agree that Europol should be working on terrorist issues, to today, where these issues are far more coordinated and far more accepted as being and having to be dealt with by Europol as a policing agency. It has also established a counterterrorist task force as part of this expanded mandate, and it also has new analysis work files specifically related to terrorism and serious crimes. Now, how much, in a sense, has Europol now become an actor in terms of fighting counterterrorism? And this is something that obviously a lot of practitioners are interested in. How important is Europol? And certainly what we can see is that it's been very significantly reinforced. Firstly, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Also in terms of assessment, of course, Islamist terrorism, religion-based terrorism remains in their perception an immediate threat to the European Union. We just saw a number of different attacks in Europe and also in the United Kingdom. The Home Office has just raised the terrorist alert to the highest level. Europol's counterterrorist efforts are mainly directed towards this. Of course, there's other terrorist activities that are also being looked at, for instance, ethno-nationalist activities, here in particular the role of ETA in the Basque Country in Spain, but also increasingly far-right terrorism that is being looked at much more thoroughly. Other forms of terrorism and radicalization are therefore also considered as imminent threats. However, should one wish to increase the effectiveness, it could be a suggestion that Europol's counterterrorism efforts could be strengthened by firstly the newly created European Counterterrorism Center that was created in Europol in January 2016. That is now an operations hub, operations center, and also a hub of expertise in this area, and reflects the growing need for the EU to strengthen its response to terrorism. It focuses on obviously tackling foreign fighters, sharing intelligence and expertise on terrorism fighting between the various member states, also through the terrorist financing tracking program and the financial intelligence units. It helps to monitor and to suggest preventive measures against online terrorist propaganda and extremism. It helps illegal arms trafficking and also aids international cooperation amongst different counterterrorism authorities. Now, in general, its role comprises, therefore, analyzing the gathered information from strategic, tactical, and operational perspectives, undertaking threat and risk assessment, and based on that result, then crafting and implementing awareness activities. Upon request, also, Europol can suggest operational investigations to the member states through a variety of different means. In terms of monitoring, tracking, and preventing all forms of illicit trafficking, it's also involved in terms of nuclear materials, strong radiological sources, arms, ammunition, explosives, as well as weapons of mass destruction. And finally, it also establishes regular contact and a sound relationship with various experts in terms of coping with terrorism and counter-proliferations within the member states, and also in relation to third countries and international bodies where the Europol has acquired quite an important network of different activities. I think I will end on this note just to say that Europol has been one of the solutions to push forward in terms of policing cooperation, but also importantly in terms of intelligence cooperation. It has helped in a number of different instances, particularly related to terrorism, but also to other forms of serious and organized crime. And I'll be very much looking forward to your questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much, and I'll be gladly passing on to the next speaker now. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions so far? So if there's a question, we will return that later. Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Kaunert. You focus on the European difficulties in intelligence, police, and criminal activities. And now I see Mrs. Sarah Leonard. The board is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference and to the chair of the panel. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, although virtually rather than physically. So in terms of the program, it works very well, I think, because I will be building on some of the issues that the previous speaker talked about. So I'm going to focus on one of the acute challenges that the EU is facing at the moment in the field of internal security, and that is actually Brexit and its consequences. So as you probably know, we are still, and I'm saying we because I work in England, so I'm based in the UK. So the UK is still in the process of negotiating its future relationship with the EU now that it has left. And unfortunately, no solution, no treaty is to be signed in the next couple of days. So I won't be able to tell you what the new arrangements are, but what I will be able to discuss is what is actually being negotiated and what the positions of the EU and of the UK are, and what the vision of the future cooperation on internal security is. So the first thing to underline is that in the run-up to the EU membership referendum, there was actually very little talk about internal security. There was very little talk about the role that the UK had played and its contribution to European cooperation on counterterrorism and against crime. And there was also very little discussion about how then, should the UK leave the EU, how would this relationship be organized? And so I think that now all the uncertainty that we see is the result of not having really considered these issues in advance. So if we look back at what happened in the run-up to the referendum, there wasn't much talk about internal security. The few people who expressed a view said that actually the UK would be better off being outside the EU, blaming the EU and blaming free movement for actually the terrorist threats in the UK and for criminal activities. So there were some people on the side of the leave in the referendum saying that actually the UK would be better off and would be more secure outside the EU. There were, of course, a few people with opposite views, and notably Rob Wainwright, who was at the time the director of Europol and who's originally British, saying that actually the UK had tremendously benefited in terms of its security from being part of the EU, and that actually it would really harm itself should it leave the EU. And so in the end, as you know, there was a majority in favor of leaving the EU, and that has left now the UK with a problem and a challenge in terms of redefining its relationship with the EU. And certainly what the British government has found is that actually there were several tools that they had access to once they were in the EU, and they had kind of assumed that they would be able to continue to have access to them. And now they are realizing that actually the situation is far more complex, and that they may actually find themselves without access to the tools that they have been using in the last few years, and that actually have made a significant difference to the fight against crime and against terrorism. And we have written a paper, a research paper, which has been co-authored with the previous speaker, with Christine Kaunert, where we actually seek to explain how can we make sense of this position of the UK in the negotiations. And so one of the dimensions that we are exploring is actually we look back at the special role that the UK has played in the development of international security cooperation in the EU. And we find that actually the UK was always in a very special position, and it had managed to negotiate a truly unique position for itself in international security cooperation. So I won't go into all the EU technicalities with the opt-in and the opt-outs, but you probably know that the UK was and still is obviously outside the Schengen area, but was nevertheless able to access some of the tools of cooperation. And so in a sense, the fact that the UK had managed to be in this unique, in this exceptional position when it was a member of the EU was actually giving them, if you like, the impression that they would be able to negotiate for themselves such a unique position again. So what we have seen is that in the negotiations, and that explains also why these negotiations have been so long and so difficult, the European Union and the UK are in different positions, and they have a different vision of what the future could be. And in particular, the UK is insisting, you may remember that they insisted that they still wanted access to the European arrest warrant. Now they seem to have accepted that this won't be possible outside the EU, but they certainly still want access to some of the databases that the EU has developed over the last few years. So one of those actually concerns the exchange of data for law enforcement, and it's the European Criminal Records Information Database. And it's something really important in terms of facilitating judicial cooperation in criminal matters, as basically it enables the law enforcement community to exchange data about foreign nationals' criminal history very quickly. So to give you that example, whereas in the past it would have taken more than 60 days to obtain information, thanks to this database, then it's just a matter of a couple of days. And so on, there are various examples like that. And so what we see is that basically there is this assumption from the British government that some special arrangements can be made, whereas the EU actually considers that once the UK is no longer a member state, then it is outside, if you like, this club, this cooperation, and that it is impossible to actually, for example, transfer sensitive data, like the data of criminal outside the European Union. And so that's why in that area we have reached a bit of an impasse probably. And one of the other issues is also that the UK approached the negotiations by saying, well, we can actually separate our cooperation in different areas into different treaties. So we could have a treaty about trade, we could have a treaty about security. And security is one of the areas where the EU also benefits a lot from the UK's contribution. But the EU has taken another stand, saying that actually these issues are interlinked, and you cannot possibly negotiate one treaty on some issues and not on others. And so we are at the moment in a difficult situation. As you know, we are still in this transition period, but comes the end of the year, actually the transition period will end and the UK will find itself outside the EU. And at the moment, it is not clear what arrangements would be put in place. So what we can say is that actually the EU-UK future relationships negotiations can be understood through the lenses of exceptionalism, in the sense that the UK has, for various historical reasons, considered itself to be different to the other member states. And actually this belief was in a sense accepted throughout the period when it was a member of the European Union by the other EU member states, that always accommodated its demands for a different treatment. And so you could see that with other EU member states accepting that they're not a member of the Schengen area, that they're not a member of the Euro. And in a sense, the UK carried this belief of being exceptional into the negotiations, hoping that its arguments that it can be treated like any other state would still be accepted by the other EU member states. Because what the EU has tended to say is that the UK cannot have possibly better arrangements than what it had when it was a member state, that the UK cannot obtain what other third states have not obtained. But the UK government has disputed that, believing that its exceptional status would grant an exceptional treatment. And so it is true that you could say it is in the interest of both parties to find an agreement, but it's now November, and it's not clear what agreement can actually be found between the UK and the EU, especially if the idea that we cannot have one agreement on one issue without agreeing on all issues. If this continues to be the stance, then it looks as if we won't have an agreement in the next few weeks, which will have a major impact on how the law enforcement community, both in the UK and in the EU, can actually tackle organized crime, terrorism. So I think this is a very important issue, not only for the government, but actually for the population of all the countries concerned, because it is ultimately the security of the population that is at stake. So I will also leave it at that, and very much look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sarah Leonard. Thank you for your great contribution. And now I see the other speaker, Dr. Can Kasaboğlu. I think he is ready. Kasaboğlu, hazır mısınız?
Hazırım. Ben hemen bir şey sorayım. Q&A'de hocam şeyi görüyorum. Yani bu tercüme ile ilgili bir takım problemler olduğuna dair çeşitli ifadeler var.
Evet.
Türkçe de yapabilirim, İngilizce de yapabilirim. Siz nasıl tercih
Salon
edersiniz?
görevlisi arkadaşlar bununla ilgileniyorlar mutlaka. Onlar da bu soruları okuyorlardır. Siz kendinizi nasıl devam hissediyorsanız ama tercüme problemi varsa İngilizce yapmanız tabii ki daha tercih edilebilir.
Tabii.
Buyurun, 10 dakika süreyle söz sizin Can Bey.
Teşekkür ederim. Thank you all. As I saw some comments in the Q&A section as to the translation problem, I'd like to, for our foreign guests also, I'd like to carry on in English. Thank you so much, all the colleagues that I learned a lot, and Hassam for this organization. This morning we talked about artificial intelligence, new horizons in the future warfighting capabilities, and now it is, I think, a very complementary privilege to discuss about the intelligence aspects of that. Well, I'm a think tanker, so I'm going to be briefly talking about the new emerging infosphere and the think tanks and private intelligence companies' role in the future intelligence ecosystem, if you like. I think we got two waves in open source intelligence. One was the good old Cold War times, that open source intelligence was actually doing good. There are really remarkable records suggesting that, for instance, Pearl Harbor was detected first by the US open source intelligence community. But I think up until the inauguration of internet, social media, and information revolution that we have been monitoring nowadays, it has taken a backseat, especially as to the Cold War, the spy epic stories in the Cold War, as well as the structure of intelligence organizations. I don't see in any kind of intelligence structures, be it the military structure as Dr. Said Yılmaz is very familiar with, as well as the civilian intelligence organizations. I don't think that open source intelligence guys were the rock stars of these organizations. It was more of an espionage and analytical job to grasp and produce meaningful output as to intelligence affairs. But with the internet revolution, and especially recalling the very fact that back in 2013, humanity produced 4.4 zettabytes of data, of raw, unstructured data, which was actually more than we have produced within 2 million years since the early cave paintings. I think with that, open source intelligence is now the rising trend among the intelligence community. And this data that we have produced, especially in the sphere of internet, is growing exponentially, which gives think tanks and open source intelligence firms a true edge in advancing what they have been doing up until now. Well, I'm going to be giving two basic examples here to develop a thorough understanding what we are doing, two case studies, if you like, that would give a firm clue, I guess, about the limits of open source intelligence. A few years ago, we have detected a very critical Russian electronic warfare system deployment in Syria, Kurashuka-4, which we knew initially was deployed in operations in eastern Ukraine, actually heavily disrupting information communication infrastructure in eastern Ukraine, enabling the pro-Russian rebels to advance their operations. But the interesting thing here, we detected Kurashuka-4 deployment in Syria from a Russia Today upload to YouTube. And it wasn't about Kurashuka-4, it was about the Hmeimim military base in western Syria, in Latakia. And at a time when they were filming the landing of a Sukhoi-24 or Sukhoi-25 attack aircraft, for just 2 seconds in the backseat, you see just a shadow of a weapon system for about just 2 seconds. A thorough assessment of open source intelligence into this upload showed that there was an electronic warfare system in the first sense, and a further investigation, all open source investigation, showcased that it was a Kurashuka-4. So what I asked to military personnel at the time and intelligence professionals at the time, that during the Cold War, say right after Hafez al-Assad assumed power in Syria, what kind of intelligence effort would it take to detect a Soviet electronic warfare system being deployed in Moscow's satellite in the Levant? Well, definitely a huge human intelligence effort coupled with an electronic intelligence and signals intelligence effort. Well, in the 21st century, it took a YouTube upload by a Russian news outlet and some open source intelligence firms and some geeks in the social media to detect that. Very recently, during the ongoing Azerbaijani-Armenian clashes around Nagorno-Karabakh, my intelligence team, and we published that very recently, we detected a Russian Special Forces sniper rifle, a T-5000, made by Orsis, a special Russian firm with strong ties to the regime, actually shadowly owned by Dmitry Rogozin, one of the key figures of the regime, was deployed along the Armenian front line. So this was the first and foremost clue that we had as to the level of Russian either little green man involvement or the Russian defense technological and industrial base involvement in the ongoing bonanza in Nagorno-Karabakh favoring Armenia. Again, detecting, and the beautiful thing is, we know that information from an upload from the Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense, a YouTube upload. The ongoing war and the uploads to the internet gave us a lot of clues, millions of clues, as to the weapon systems used, even the munitions of choice, depending on the blast effects. So it boils down to what? It boils down to the very question of what is our main assessment and intelligence gathering tools in the 21st century. Is open source intelligence replacing human, ELINT, EMINT in some segments? Yes, it is doing that. A second question would follow, for instance, how many main battle tanks Turkey has right now in its arsenal? How many F-16 fighters Greece can just dispatch at a time in the Aegean? How about the Russian T-14 Armata main battle tank modernization? How it is going, and what kind of numbers we are talking about in the Russian arsenal? Well, instead of an intelligence organization, now you can check IISS military balance, Jane's defense, or CIPRI. Again, it boils down to the second question. What does it mean top secret nowadays? The number of tanks in the Turkish arsenal, the level of readiness of the Greek Air Force, or Russia's T-14 Armata main battle tank developments, are they top secret these days as they were during the Cold War times? Yet again, it boils down to the nations, states, and individuals' interactions with information. I personally know that in some Gulf states, for instance, an article from Newsweek can be top secret, whereas in any American or British writing, you know, even the numbers in the arsenals are open source information nowadays. The last question that I'm gonna ask is about organizations. How are we gonna reform intelligence organizations against the backdrop of the changes in top secret? From now on, the things that we knew that they were top secret are no more top secret. And secondly, how are we gonna reform our intelligence organizations to just grasp the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time? For instance, Bellingcat in the sphere of internet, for example, is now a much more influential intelligence organization than many state security apparatuses in the world. The Federation of the Russian Federation, the armed forces of Russian Federation, is now exercising a selfie ban and followed by a smartphone ban at its military ranks, not due to any nation's national security apparatus or human success, but due to outlets like Bellingcat, because even using by shadows and everything, they were able to reveal many secrets of the Russian concepts of operations. Last question here that I'm going to ask in a provocative fashion is, if the nature of top secret is changed with the incorporation of big data, think tanks, open source intelligence companies, and if the ways and the means that we are gathering and interpreting information is changing, again with the incorporation of new actors, how to reorganize intelligence organizations which are gerontocratic by nature? Because I think this is a generational also dilemma here, because the new actors like think tanks, like open source intelligence firms, and outlets like Bellingcat are young organizations full of young people, whereas intelligence agencies, military and security apparatuses are governed by an older generation. Due to the promotion systems, they are gerontocratic organizations. And how to just adapt to this new reality? And I think adaptation is really key here, because adaptation, especially in the intelligence sphere, I think draws a line between having a future and not having a future. So here I'm going to stop. I'll be happy to address your questions if you have some. But I think the key point, if I have to summarize in a nutshell in one sentence, is open source information, open source intelligence is a revolution right now. And it is not the state security apparatuses, but think tanks and other related actors are surfing on this wave. And I think this will determine the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kasaboğlu. Dear audience, our session was focused on the future of intelligence and then the institutional governance. First, I spoke to intelligence role in future wars. Then Mr. Christian Connor and Sarah Leonard focused on the European security cooperation, particularly on intelligence, police activities, and criminal issues. Then Mr. Kasaboğlu, Dr. Kasaboğlu also talked about open intelligence and the role of think tanks in this matter. So we are going to close our session, and I would like to thank you for your participation. And please remind that the other sessions are in progress. So I would like to thank you once again, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Many thanks. Bye.
Bye, and thanks for coming.